In the years before the Second World War, Germany and the United States were two nations heading in opposite directions. On the surface, both had endured economic hardship, political instability, and deep social tensions. But the ways they responded and the societies they became could not have been more different. After the First World War ended in 1918, Germany was a broken country. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh penalties, including massive reparations payments, military restrictions, and territorial losses. The German people felt humiliated. Many believed they had been unfairly blamed for a war that had involved all the great powers of Europe. The new Weimar Republic, formed in 1919, struggled to stabilize the country. Throughout the 1920s, Germany's economy was volatile. Hyperinflation reached its peak in 1923. At one point, workers were paid twice a day because prices rose so fast that money lost value within hours. Savings were wiped out. A loaf of bread that had cost a few marks before the war soared into the billions. Families used stacks of paper currency to light fires or paper their walls. By contrast, the United States emerged from the First World War relatively strong. It had become the world's leading industrial power. The 1920s were known as the Roaring Twenties, a time of booming consumer culture, expanding cities, and rising wages. Americans were buying automobiles, radios, refrigerators, and factory-made clothing. Mass production, pioneered by figures like Henry Ford, made goods cheaper and more accessible. But the good times did not last. In 1929, the Wall Street crash triggered a worldwide economic collapse. In Germany, already weakened by debt and dependency on foreign loans, the situation became desperate. By 1932, 1 in 3 German workers was unemployed. Small businesses failed. Farmers lost their land. The middle class, already bitter about earlier economic losses, now felt abandoned and betrayed. In the United States, the Great Depression also brought widespread suffering. Unemployment climbed, banks failed, and many Americans lost their homes. But in 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt launched the New Deal. This set of programs aimed to provide relief, create jobs, and stabilize the financial system. The U.S. government invested heavily in infrastructure, public works, and social support. Though controversial, these policies helped the U.S. begin a slow recovery. Germany took a different path. In that same year, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Backed by the Nazi Party, Hitler promised to restore German pride, rebuild the economy, and end the chaos. Within months, civil liberties were stripped away, political opponents were jailed or killed, and the Nazis took total control. The dictatorship began reshaping every part of German life. Hitler's government launched massive rearmament programs. Military factories reopened. Highways, called autobahns, were built to improve transport and create jobs. Unemployment fell, but only because of state control, forced labor, and preparation for war. Behind the scenes, the regime targeted Jews, communists, trade unionists, and others seen as threats. Anti-Semitic laws were passed. Violence became part of daily life. Fear and obedience were encouraged. By the late 1930s, Germany's economy was no longer designed to support ordinary consumers. It was a war economy in disguise. Civilian production was tightly limited. Rationing began even before war officially started. Basic goods like butter, coffee, and meat were already in short supply. People were expected to sacrifice for the fatherland. Comfort was discouraged. Uniformity and discipline replaced individual choice. In the United States, meanwhile, consumer culture remained central to national identity. Even during the Great Depression, Americans held on to ideas of personal freedom and private life. movies, radio, and advertising continued to shape public expectations. A working man might not have much, but he still expected coffee in the morning, maybe a cigarette on break, and meat on the dinner plate, at least when he could afford it. The role of business in American society also differed. Companies like Hershey's, Coca-Cola, and General Motors operated with private ownership and mass production in mind. Efficiency and profit drove innovation. Even as war approached, these companies maintained large-scale distribution networks that reached every corner of the country. They were ready to adapt when wartime demands came. This fundamental contrast between a centralized authoritarian regime focused on control and a democratic capitalist society built on abundance would become more visible during the war. But even before the first shots were fired, the differences were clear in everyday life. A German child in the late 1930s would grow up with national slogans, uniforms, and shortages. An American child the same age would grow up with comic books, birthday cake, and advertising jingles. Politically, the United States remained wary of involvement in another European conflict. Isolationist sentiment was strong. Many Americans believed that the First World War had been a mistake. They watched Hitler's rise with concern, but focused on domestic recovery. However, by the end of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and war erupted in Europe, the US began to shift. Supplies and support were sent to Britain and France, even before direct involvement. Germany, for its part, felt powerful. After the swift victories in Poland, Norway, Denmark, and France, Hitler's army looked unstoppable. But behind the battlefield success, the German home front was under strain. Food supplies were already stretched. The Nazi promise of prosperity was increasingly hollow. Most civilians experienced long work hours, limited rations, and constant surveillance. The ideal of the loyal, self-sacrificing citizen left little room for personal comfort. By the time the United States entered the war in December of 1941, the material divide between the two countries was enormous. The US had access to vast natural resources, a highly developed industrial base, and a population untouched by enemy bombing. Germany, on the other hand, was tightening its grip on what little it had, while launching a massive invasion of the Soviet Union that would soon prove disastrous. As the world plunged into full-scale war in the early 1940s, Germany and the United States mobilized their economies and societies in radically different ways. Although both nations redirected national resources toward the war effort, the underlying philosophies and outcomes of their strategies could not have been more distinct. In Germany, total war was not just a necessity, it was a core part of the Nazi worldview. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle, particularly leaders like Hermann Göring and later Albert Speer, viewed war as a test of racial and national strength. In this framework, sacrifice and discipline were virtues. Civilian comforts were seen as distractions. The regime prioritized weapons production over all else, even if it meant cutting essential supplies for the public. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the German war economy was already straining. The initial blitzkrieg victories in Poland and Western Europe had created an illusion of efficiency. In reality, the German economy remained fragmented and poorly coordinated. Dozens of agencies competed for resources. Private companies worked with the regime but retained limited autonomy, often bogged down by conflicting demands from different Nazi offices. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production in early 1942, attempted to bring order to the chaos. Speer streamlined production, centralized control, and introduced forced labor on a massive scale. Millions of people from occupied countries were compelled to work in German factories under harsh, often inhumane conditions. These efforts increased output, but only at enormous human cost. For ordinary Germans, The consequences were immediate. Consumer goods became scarce. Food was rationed in strict quantities. Items like coffee, chocolate, and tobacco were rare, if available at all. Even clothing and shoes were limited, with synthetic materials replacing traditional fabrics. Daily life was a constant negotiation between needs and availability. Substitution and improvisation became survival skills. In contrast, the United States entered the war with a different approach and a vastly superior economic base. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the U.S. officially joined the conflict. Mobilization was rapid. Within months, American industry was transformed into what President Roosevelt famously called the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once made cars or washing machines were retooled to produce tanks, airplanes, and ships. Assembly lines expanded. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, taking on roles traditionally held by men. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol of this shift. Wages rose, unemployment dropped, and production soared. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. But what made the American effort truly unique was not just output, it was philosophy. The U.S. War Department, in coordination with private industry, made a deliberate decision to maintain morale by supporting the everyday comfort of soldiers. This included how they were fed, clothed, and cared for psychologically. American soldiers, whether stationed in Europe, the Pacific, or North Africa, were to be well-equipped and well-fed. This principle took visible form in the development of military rations. The U.S. Army introduced a variety of standardized rations tailored for different conditions. The K ration, designed for mobile troops and short-term use, included canned meat, biscuits, dried fruit, and powdered beverage mixes. The D ration, a compact emergency chocolate bar, was formulated to be both high in calories and able to withstand heat. Larger B rations and C rations were used for more stable conditions, with menus including canned stews, vegetables, crackers, and even desserts. Most notably, American rations often included luxury items, at least by wartime standards. Packaged cigarettes were standard, usually around 4 to 5 per meal unit. Chewing gum, instant coffee, candy, and sometimes small tins of fruit or jam were common. These extras were not accidental. Military planners believed that morale was as important as firepower. If a soldier felt cared for, he would fight better, stay healthier, and suffer less from the psychological toll of combat. Private companies played a central role. The Hershey Company developed the D-ration chocolate bar at the request of the U.S. Army in the late 1930s. It was designed to be compact, high in calories, and difficult to melt. Though not intended to be delicious, early versions were dense and bitter. It represented a direct collaboration between civilian industry and military logistics. Philip Morris, Lucky Strike, and Camel supplied cigarettes. Wrigley produced chewing gum. These companies saw wartime service as patriotic duty, but they also knew that familiarity with their brands would be valuable in the post-war consumer market. This collaboration between government and business was a cornerstone of the American war effort. Unlike in Germany, where the state absorbed and controlled private firms, the U.S. maintained private ownership while using centralized coordination through agencies like the War Production Board. This allowed for rapid scaling while preserving innovation and efficiency. Companies were rewarded for speed, quality, and volume. On the home front, American civilians also made sacrifices. Meat, sugar, rubber, and gasoline were rationed. Victory gardens sprang up. Women saved kitchen grease for explosives production. Children collected scrap metal. But even with restrictions, the average American household maintained a quality of life far above that of wartime Europe. Retail stores remained open. Hollywood continued to release films. Coffee and cigarettes were not luxuries. They were normal parts of daily life. For soldiers, this continuity mattered. Receiving familiar items in the field reminded them of home. It was a psychological anchor. It also made a strong impression on allies and on enemies. As German soldiers and civilians would later discover, the standard contents of an American ration pack were astonishing. Items that had vanished from German shelves years earlier, chocolate, real coffee, fresh bread, canned meat, were showing up in the hands of ordinary American privates. In Germany, military rations told a different story. At the beginning of the war, Wehrmacht troops were issued simple fare: bread, sausage, cheese, and potatoes, usually prepared by field kitchens. As the war dragged on and supply lines stretched thin, quality declined sharply. Soldiers often relied on captured food or what they could forage. By 1944, many German units, especially on the Eastern Front, were underfed and poorly supplied. Cigarettes were rare and rationed. Chocolate was nearly impossible to find. Ersatz products, cheap substitutes made from limited ingredients, became the norm. Ersatz coffee was made from roasted barley or chicory. Ersatz chocolate used vegetable fats instead of cocoa. The taste was poor, but there was no choice. These shortages were not just logistical failures, they were signs of a collapsing economy. The contrast could not have been clearer. For Germans, food was about survival. For Americans, it was about strength and spirit. The German soldier might carry dry bread and lard into battle. The American GI might carry canned spaghetti, chocolate, and a pack of Lucky Strikes. One was enduring a war, the other was supplied for it. As the Second World War intensified across Europe, the lived experiences of soldiers on the front lines increasingly reflected the deeper differences between the societies that had sent them. Nowhere was this contrast more immediate and more surprising than in what soldiers ate, carried, and consumed each day. The American and German armies were both engaged in brutal, exhausting combat. But the material conditions of their lives on the battlefield revealed opposing worlds. By the early 1940s, the German Wehrmacht was deeply entrenched in campaigns across Eastern and Western Europe, North Africa, and eventually inside the Soviet Union. The demands of maintaining such a wide front placed enormous strain on Germany's logistical systems. While the German army had demonstrated remarkable speed and tactical success in the early years of the war, particularly in Poland and France, its supply infrastructure was never fully modernized or consistent. German soldiers were issued what was known as the iron ration, intended for emergency use. It typically included hard biscuits, a tin of preserved meat, and sometimes dried vegetables. Under ideal circumstances, troops were fed through mobile field kitchens, which prepared hot meals using ingredients transported from supply depots. A typical hot meal might include stew made from potatoes, cabbage, and some meat, if any was available. Bread was often the central food item, served with lard, jam, or processed cheese. But ideal circumstances rarely existed on the front lines. As the war dragged on, supplies became increasingly erratic. German soldiers fighting in the Soviet Union, for example, often went for days without proper meals. Supply convoys were delayed or destroyed, and food rations were stretched thin. Cold weather and long marches made caloric needs critical, but those needs were not always met. Soldiers sometimes relied on looting, bartering, or scavenging local resources. In the harsh winter months, this could mean eating frozen potatoes, stolen livestock, or whatever could be found. Meanwhile, the American soldier, commonly referred to as a GI, lived under a very different set of conditions. The U.S. Army invested heavily in logistics, transportation, and provisioning. Even in active combat zones, the military placed high priority on ensuring that its troops were well supplied. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for delivering food and equipment, became one of the most efficient arms of the U.S. military machine. The standard American combat ration varied depending on the context. The K ration was designed for paratroopers, scouts, and mobile infantry. It came in a compact box divided into breakfast, lunch, and dinner units. A typical K ration might include canned meat or eggs, biscuits, a powdered beverage mix, chewing gum, a chocolate bar, a packet of instant coffee, and 4 cigarettes. Sugar cubes, a small tin of cheese, or a fruit bar might round out the package. These rations were not gourmet meals, but they were consistent, high in calories, and included small luxuries that made a big psychological difference. In more stable positions, GIs received C rations or B rations. The C ration included canned meals such as beef stew, beans with bacon, or meat with spaghetti. Accessories typically included sugar, coffee, candy, toilet paper, matches, and cigarettes. B rations were bulk supplies used to prepare hot meals for larger groups. These were often served by mess units and could include fresh bread, butter, vegetables, and meat. Compared to their German counterparts, American soldiers had a dramatically wider and more reliable variety of food. The inclusion of items like chocolate, chewing gum, and cigarettes was deliberate. American planners understood the morale-boosting effect of familiar comforts. Even something as simple as Wrigley's gum or a Hershey bar could momentarily ease the stress of battle. Cigarettes were so commonly distributed that they became synonymous with soldier life. Some GIs traded them for favors or small goods. Others simply smoked as a way to calm nerves. German soldiers, by contrast, had limited access to tobacco, and sweets were virtually non-existent. The Nazi regime had banned American imports years earlier, and domestic production could not match demand. Chocolate and coffee were already scarce among civilians. On the front lines, they were nearly impossible to obtain. Ersatz, or substitute products, became common. Coffee made from roasted barley, chocolate made without cocoa, and tobacco mixed with fillers. The taste was inferior, but soldiers had few options. This material disparity began to have a psychological effect. While the German army had been taught discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty to the Führer, American troops were encouraged to maintain personal comfort and group morale. GIs often had access to recreational gear, small radios, reading materials, and even care packages from home. USO shows and Red Cross services brought music, letters, and entertainment to frontline units. Some German officers noted the difference with frustration or disbelief. How could an enemy soldier be expected to fight effectively when he carried candy and smoked Lucky Strikes between engagements? But the Americans were not less disciplined. They were simply operating under a different philosophy. Their society had equipped them not only to kill, but to endure. The culture of abundance followed them even into the mud and danger of war. Encounters between soldiers began to reveal these differences more plainly. In the later years of the war, when German troops were captured or surrendered, they often expressed shock at the personal supplies carried by their American counterparts. Former Wehrmacht soldiers would recall seeing American backpacks filled with items they had not seen in years: real chocolate, canned peaches, cigarettes in sealed foil packs. For many Germans, it was the first time they understood just how far behind their nation had fallen. One former German soldier, interviewed after the war, described being offered a cigarette by an American GI shortly after being taken prisoner. "It was the first real tobacco I had tasted in 2 years," he said. "I thought he was a general. Only a general would have had something like that in our army." Stories like this circulated among both prisoners and civilians. The contents of an American ration became a kind of legend. Some Germans refused to believe the items were standard issue, assuming instead that these soldiers were from elite units or had looted supplies. The truth, that even low-ranking American privates were given chocolate and meat regularly, was hard to accept. The contrast extended beyond food and comfort. American soldiers wore higher quality uniforms, better boots, and carried more personal gear. Their weapons were often better maintained, and their vehicles more plentiful. While German troops had been instructed to share equipment or make do with shortages, the American war machine had built-in redundancy. If a GI's gear failed, it could be replaced. If a truck broke down, another would arrive. None of this guaranteed victory on the battlefield. German soldiers were often highly skilled and deeply committed, especially in the early years of the war. But over time, material advantage translated into tactical and strategic success. Well-fed, well-rested, and well-equipped troops tend to perform better, recover faster, and maintain discipline longer. The small luxuries inside a ration pack were part of a larger picture, one where the American system had proven more resilient, more adaptive, and more humane. By the final years of the Second World War, the tide had turned decisively against Germany. The rapid offensives of earlier campaigns had slowed, then reversed. German cities were being bombed, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and Allied forces were advancing from the West. In this environment of growing desperation, many Germans, both soldiers and civilians, experienced their first direct encounters with American troops. What struck many of them most was not just the presence of a powerful enemy, but the material world that the Americans brought with them. One of the earliest and most revealing moments of this culture shock occurred in the experience of German prisoners of war. As the Wehrmacht began to retreat and collapse in various theaters of war, especially in France, North Africa, and later in Germany itself, thousands of German soldiers surrendered or were captured. For many, the transition from combatant to prisoner was abrupt and humiliating. But what came next was, in many cases, unexpected. Captured German soldiers were typically searched, processed, and then placed in temporary camps. Once their immediate status was confirmed, they were given food and basic supplies. The rations handed to them often mirrored the standard issue given to American troops: canned meat, biscuits, instant coffee, sometimes chewing gum or cigarettes. To these prisoners, many of whom had eaten nothing but dry bread and watered soup for days, the rations seemed extravagant. One former German soldier recalled being handed a box containing canned stew, a chocolate bar, and a pack of Chesterfield cigarettes. He had assumed it was a mistake. "Surely this was meant for someone else," he later said. "I had not seen chocolate in years, and now the enemy was giving it to me." These stories were not isolated. Across multiple fronts, German POWs were stunned not only by the generosity of their captors, but by the quality and consistency of American food. The coffee tasted real. The meat was rich and well-preserved. Even the packaging impressed them: clean, organized, and clearly mass-produced at a scale that felt impossible. Many had grown up under a regime that promised German superiority in all things. Now they were holding in their hands a piece of a world that seemed more advanced, more humane, and far more capable than their own. The shock was not limited to soldiers. As the Allied forces moved through France and into German territory in the final years of the war, civilians also came into contact with American troops. In towns, villages, and bombed-out cities, German families found themselves face-to-face with young men who were often barely older than their own sons. These encounters were shaped by tension, fear, and uncertainty, but they were also shaped by hunger. For years, German civilians had lived under rationing and scarcity. Butter, meat, coffee, and sugar were severely limited. Ersatz products, substitutes made from inferior or artificial ingredients, were common. Chocolate, in particular, had all but disappeared. When American soldiers entered German towns, they sometimes handed out candy to children or offered cigarettes to local men. These gestures were small, but the impact was profound. A young girl from a village near Aachen remembered seeing a US soldier unwrap a Hershey bar and break it in half to share with her. She had never tasted real chocolate before. Her father, a former schoolteacher, wept silently as he watched. He had taught that Germany was the most civilized nation in Europe. Now, it was the enemy who gave his daughter sweets. These kinds of interactions quickly spread through word of mouth. Stories circulated of GIs handing out canned peaches, of troops sharing chewing gum with curious children, and of entire families being fed from surplus military supplies. American soldiers were sometimes surprised by the reactions. What seemed like an ordinary gesture to them, a spare cigarette, an extra biscuit, was interpreted as an act of immense generosity by people who had gone without for so long. The emotional impact was compounded by the contrast. German propaganda had for years painted Americans as decadent, weak, or racially inferior. Yet now, the same Americans were marching across Germany with clean uniforms, steady supplies, and a relaxed confidence that defied Nazi stereotypes. Their vehicles were well-fueled, their radios worked, and their soldiers smoked American cigarettes while handing out chocolate to children. The cognitive dissonance was difficult for many Germans to process. For prisoners of war, the shock sometimes came with a deep sense of shame. These were men who had fought, often fiercely, for their country. Now they were being fed better in enemy captivity than they had been during active duty. Some began to question the ideology they had been taught. Others quietly marveled at the efficiency and compassion of their captors. A former German tank commander, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of everything: food, cigarettes, fuel, even soap. It was like being on another planet. He described watching US troops distribute food to civilians in a captured town. They had just fought us for 3 days. Now they were giving bread to the people we were supposed to be defending. Of course, not all encounters were peaceful or generous. War remained brutal, and not all American troops were friendly. In some places, tensions flared and looting or violence occurred. But overall, the material presence of the American military, its abundance, organization, and willingness to share, left a lasting impression on both POWs and civilians. The Red Cross also played a role. With US support, the organization delivered parcels to prisoners of war that often included coffee, chocolate, canned meat, and cigarettes. For many German POWs, these Red Cross packages became lifelines and sources of psychological relief. They provided a rare sense of dignity in an otherwise humiliating situation. As German civilians began to interact more frequently with occupying forces, some found work in American camps or were hired to perform local labor. These arrangements often provided access to American food or supplies, which further widened the awareness of just how different life was on the other side. Even discarded ration cans or wrappers were collected and reused. The American waste became German treasure. Children, in particular, became unofficial ambassadors between the two worlds. Their curiosity and innocence allowed them to approach soldiers more freely. In return, they were often given chocolate, chewing gum, or canned fruit. Some learned to say simple English phrases like "chocolate, please," or "chewing gum, mister." For them, the American presence was less about war and more about wonder. These early encounters formed the beginning of a shift in German perception. For years, the Nazi regime had demanded sacrifice in the name of a better future. But now, the people they had been taught to hate were the ones feeding them, clothing them, and treating them with a degree of kindness they had not expected. The shock went beyond the physical. It was psychological, emotional, and cultural. When the guns finally fell silent in the spring of 1945, Germany was not just defeated, it was devastated. The Third Reich had collapsed, its cities were reduced to rubble, and its people faced famine, displacement, and psychological shock. Amid this ruin, the occupying American forces arrived not only with military strength, but with a supply chain that seemed limitless. For many Germans, the war's end brought the beginning of another kind of confrontation. Not one fought with bullets, but with candy bars, cigarettes, and canned goods. The surrender of Nazi Germany in May of 1945 divided the country into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. The American zone included large parts of southern and central Germany, regions like Bavaria, Hesse, and parts of Württemberg. These areas became the testing ground for a new relationship between the former enemy and the world's emerging superpower. The American forces moved quickly to establish control and provide stability. But their presence brought more than order. It brought material culture: trucks loaded with rations, convoys of supplies, and storage depots stocked with everything from uniforms to fruit cocktail. The average German civilian, having survived years of scarcity, was now faced with an occupying army that appeared to have everything in abundance. It did not take long for this contrast to become visible in daily life. American soldiers walked the streets with full gear, well-fed and relaxed. Their meals came from mess halls or field kitchens that served hearty portions. Even the packaging was impressive: tin cans with factory labels, sealed packets of cigarettes, neat boxes of rations organized by meal type and calorie content. For German civilians, especially those in bombed-out cities or rural areas suffering from crop failures, the sight of such supplies was almost surreal. Bread had become a rare luxury by the end of the war. Meat was nearly non-existent. Many families survived on boiled potatoes, dried legumes, and whatever they could forage. Soap, razor blades, and toothpaste had vanished from shelves. In this environment, the arrival of American goods felt like a glimpse into another world. Children were often the first to make contact. Their curiosity and hunger led them to follow soldiers, gather near U.S. barracks, or wait along roadsides where convoys passed. American GIs, many of whom were barely older than the children themselves, responded with kindness. They handed out chocolate bars, chewing gum, and sometimes even entire ration kits. A single can of corned beef or a few sticks of Wrigley's gum could brighten a child's day, and in many cases, feed an entire family. One German woman, then a young girl living in the outskirts of Frankfurt, remembered how American troops would toss Hershey bars from their trucks. "We had never seen anything like it," she later recalled. "We didn't even know what it was at first. We thought it was medicine or soap. When we tasted it, we couldn't believe such a thing existed." This generosity, though informal, quickly created patterns of exchange. Some children learned to say simple English phrases like, "Hello, mister," or "Any chocolate?" Others offered flowers, handmade gifts, or small tokens in return. In some areas, black markets formed where American goods were traded between civilians, soldiers, and local intermediaries. A single can of coffee or a pack of American cigarettes could be exchanged for multiple days' worth of bread or potatoes. For many adults, the interaction with American soldiers brought more than just food. It brought a confrontation with deeply ingrained beliefs. Years of Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as corrupt, weak, or morally degenerate. Yet now, these same Americans were sharing food, helping civilians, and distributing aid without demanding obedience or ideological loyalty. The shock was not just material, it was moral. American rations in the occupation zone remained consistent with those issued during the war. The contents still included cigarettes, chocolate, canned meat, instant coffee, and other items unheard of in German households. Soldiers often shared their own rations informally. In addition, official relief efforts were launched to address the humanitarian crisis facing German civilians. The U.S. Army set up food distribution centers in towns and cities, offering soup kitchens and emergency supplies. Care packages, sent by American citizens through humanitarian organizations, became a lifeline for many German families. These boxes often included powdered milk, canned meat, flour, sugar, chocolate, and soap. For recipients, they were more than just calories. They were symbols of survival, of decency, and increasingly of admiration. In urban centers like Munich, Stuttgart, and Nuremberg, the physical transformation was visible. US military camps and supply depots became hubs of activity. Soldiers moved freely among civilians, and German workers were employed as cooks, drivers, translators, and cleaners. The daily interaction between occupiers and the occupied created a space where assumptions were challenged and relationships began to shift. This period also saw the rise of what became known colloquially as the cigarette economy. With German currency virtually worthless due to inflation and economic collapse, American cigarettes emerged as a form of de facto currency. Civilians bartered with packs of Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields. One pack could buy a haircut, a dozen eggs, or a bottle of wine. For those with access to American soldiers or to their trash, the opportunities for trade expanded. Women often played a central role in these informal economies. Some entered relationships with American soldiers, forming emotional or practical partnerships that helped them survive. Others worked in kitchens, laundries, or administrative offices set up by the US military. In many cases, they were paid in food, rations, or cigarettes. While such arrangements were often controversial and carried social stigma, they also represented one of the few viable paths to economic security in a shattered society. The abundance displayed by American forces began to influence cultural perceptions as well. Children who grew up during these years often associated the United States with kindness, modernity, and hope. German parents, despite initial resentment or shame, came to recognize the stark contrast between their own former regime and the new reality. The Americans were not perfect, but they were, in most cases, fair, generous, and orderly. American propaganda, carefully managed through military government offices, supported this impression. Leaflets, posters, and public messages emphasized democratic values, personal freedom, and economic opportunity. Unlike the brutal repression seen in the Soviet zone of occupation, the US approach aimed to win hearts and minds, and it often worked. As the occupation continued, the difference in material conditions between American and Soviet zones became even more dramatic. Refugees, displaced persons, and ordinary citizens who had the option often fled westward. In American-controlled areas, there was more food, more opportunity, and a stronger sense of future possibility. The availability of American rations and goods became both a literal and symbolic measure of stability. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Germany lay in ruins. Cities had been flattened by bombing raids, roads and railways were fractured, and the official economy was paralyzed. German currency, the Reichsmark, had lost all practical value. There was money, but there was nothing to buy. Shops stood empty. Supply chains had collapsed. For a population that had just emerged from years of war and deprivation, the struggle for survival did not end with surrender. It simply changed shape. Into this void entered a curious new form of currency: the American cigarette. During the years of occupation, particularly in the American zone, cigarettes began to function as an alternative to money. They were portable, widely desired, and, most importantly, backed by trust. Everyone knew they held value. Everyone knew they could be traded. Whether smoked, saved, or spent, cigarettes became a unit of exchange that made daily life possible in a country where traditional economics had ceased to function. This development was not orchestrated by governments or banks. It emerged from the ground up, shaped by necessity and human instinct. People needed bread, shoes, and soap. But they could not pay in Reichsmarks. Bartering goods directly was inefficient. Cigarettes, on the other hand, were always in demand. A pack of Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields had more purchasing power than a fistful of banknotes. In the chaos of post-war life, cigarettes brought order, or at least predictability. The origins of the cigarette economy were tied to the occupying American forces. U.S. soldiers received regular supplies of cigarettes in their rations. Tobacco companies such as Philip Morris, Liggett and Myers, and R.J. Reynolds continued producing at wartime levels. Each soldier could receive several packs per day, depending on the unit and supply situation. Many did not smoke. Others smoked only a portion of what they received. The rest entered circulation, given away, traded, or sold. For Germans, especially in urban centers like Frankfurt, Munich, and Stuttgart, the presence of American soldiers represented opportunity. The items carried by GIs, rations, chocolate, soap, and especially cigarettes, were not only valuable, but transformative. Civilians who had access to American camps or who worked for the occupation authorities found themselves holding the keys to a shadow economy. Soon, entire informal markets were built on the back of tobacco. In public squares, back alleys, and hidden courtyards, trade thrived. A haircut might cost 2 cigarettes. A bottle of homemade schnapps might cost 10. A pair of shoes, 20. These values were not fixed, but fluctuated according to supply and demand, mirroring real economic behavior even though the medium was smoke. Women played a crucial role in this ecosystem. Many became intermediaries, brokers, or providers of services in exchange for cigarettes. Some entered relationships with American soldiers, sometimes for companionship, sometimes for material support. The line between survival and exploitation was thin and often blurred. German women, now widows or sole caretakers, used the only resources they had to keep their families alive. For some, cigarettes meant bread. For others, they meant medicine or coal for heating. Men, too, found roles in the cigarette economy. Former soldiers, now unemployed and displaced, turned to street trading. Black market networks emerged. Some scavenged from American garbage dumps outside bases, collecting discarded food, wrappings, and, if lucky, unsmoked cigarette butts. Others took greater risks, smuggling goods across occupation zone borders, stealing from supply convoys, or forging ration coupons. The American authorities, though aware of the thriving black market, responded with measured tolerance. They understood that without cigarettes and other bartered goods, many Germans would not survive the harsh winters or the chronic shortages. Efforts were made to curb theft and prevent organized crime, but many officials on the ground looked the other way when minor trading occurred. The situation was, quite simply, too widespread to eliminate. Some Germans were offended by the dominance of cigarettes. They viewed it as a humiliation, a further symbol of defeat. Older generations in particular saw the replacement of national currency with an American import as a final erosion of dignity. One Berlin shopkeeper described the situation bitterly. "We are no longer a nation, we are a marketplace, and the currency is smoke." But for younger Germans, especially those growing up in the rubble, the cigarette was simply part of life. It bought them candy, toys, or school books. It paid for bus rides and theater tickets. In a strange twist of history, American tobacco became the foundation of an improvised social contract. At its peak, the cigarette economy rivaled official systems. In 1948, when Germany's monetary reform introduced the Deutsche Mark and abolished the Reichsmark, the black market collapsed virtually overnight. Prices stabilized. Stores began restocking. But until that turning point, the cigarette reigned. It was not only a unit of trade, it was a social marker. The type of cigarette one smoked or carried indicated status. American brands, especially Lucky Strike, Camel, and Chesterfield, were considered premium. German-made cigarettes, when available, ranked lower. Roll-your-own tobacco, made from dried leaves or floor sweepings, signaled desperation. A man lighting a clean American filtered cigarette was seen as either lucky, powerful, or connected. In cafes and public spaces, smoking was omnipresent. It became a visual shorthand for post-war identity. Men smoking as they read newspapers, women smoking while waiting in ration lines, soldiers smoking as they leaned against jeeps. The smell of tobacco mixed with the scent of coal fires and rubble dust, creating an atmosphere remembered vividly by those who lived through it. The psychological impact of this economy should not be underestimated. It shaped how Germans viewed the Americans, not just as conquerors or liberators, but as providers. The cigarette was more than a commodity. It was a symbol of modernity, affluence, and control. It represented a system that, for all its foreignness, had succeeded where their own had failed. Even in the world of politics and administration, cigarettes held sway. Local officials sometimes used them to grease decisions or negotiate favors. In some areas, ration cards were ignored entirely in favor of informal cigarette pricing. Reports from occupation authorities noted the difficulty of enforcing rules when cigarettes could solve almost any problem. Notably, the American soldiers themselves were not immune to the dynamics of this underground economy. Some capitalized on the demand, selling part of their own rations for personal profit. Others felt uncomfortable with the dependency it created. A few saw it as an opportunity to build connections with the local population, exchanging cigarettes for language lessons, souvenirs, or companionship. The German press, as it slowly returned under Allied supervision, began to comment on the phenomenon. Satirical cartoons depicted people paying rent in cartons of camels or bribing officials with packs of Chesterfields. Plays and novels referenced the absurdity of a society rebuilt on tobacco. But beneath the humor was a real sense of how deeply this temporary currency had penetrated public life. Over time, as the official economy stabilized and foreign aid began to flow into West Germany, the cigarette economy faded, but its legacy endured. Many Germans who came of age during the late 1940s would later recall this period with mixed emotions. Hardship, yes, but also resilience. They remembered the hunger, but also the joy of tasting real chocolate for the first time. They remembered the cold, but also the warmth of a shared cigarette passed among friends. By the late 1940s, Germany was a nation caught between ruin and rebirth. The war was over, the Nazi regime had collapsed, and the country was divided into zones administered by foreign powers. The physical destruction was visible in every direction: burnt-out buildings, cratered roads, and the silent gaps where once thriving neighborhoods had stood. But beneath this devastation, something unexpected was beginning to take shape: a growing fascination with the culture, lifestyle, and identity of the American occupiers. This cultural awakening did not begin with ideology or policy. It began, as so many transformations do, with ordinary people. In the early months of occupation, the most visible elements of American presence were practical: food rations, clothing, medicine, and military vehicles. But slowly, a broader picture emerged. Germans, especially the young, were exposed to more than just the material symbols of American life. They encountered American attitudes, music, speech, and behavior. What had once seemed foreign or even threatening now stirred curiosity, and in many cases, admiration. German children were among the first to be drawn in. Having grown up during the war, many had never known anything other than fear, rationing, and state propaganda. For them, the appearance of American soldiers, smiling, generous, casual, was a revelation. These soldiers gave out candy and chewing gum, spoke a language filled with slang and laughter, and carried themselves with a confidence that seemed to defy the ruined world around them. In the American-occupied zones, this fascination quickly developed into imitation. Children and teenagers began mimicking American soldiers, copying their mannerisms, their walk, even their clothing when they could get it. T-shirts, leather jackets, and denim trousers, items that had once been unknown or unavailable, became aspirational symbols. Young Germans watched how Americans dressed and behaved, and they took note. Music played a key role in deepening this cultural bond. American forces brought with them jazz, swing, and early rhythm and blues. These sounds, broadcast through military radio stations or performed live at army clubs, introduced German audiences to a completely different musical landscape. The Nazi regime had banned many of these styles, labeling them degenerate or un-German. Now, in the vacuum left by the collapse of totalitarian control, this forbidden music was not only permitted, it was celebrated. AFN, the American Forces Network, began broadcasting across occupied Germany. It played American hits, news updates, and cultural programming aimed at both US troops and German listeners. For many German youths, tuning into AFN became a daily ritual. They learned English lyrics by heart. They tried to imitate the sound of American singers. Music became a gateway to language, identity, and worldview. One teenage boy from Stuttgart later recalled hearing Louis Armstrong for the first time in a crowded cafe filled with rubble dust. "I didn't understand a single word," he said, "but I understood the feeling. It was freedom." This was not uncommon. The music spoke to emotions long suppressed: joy, spontaneity, rebellion, and hope. The American influence was also visible in cinema. The Allied authorities, especially the Americans, reintroduced film as a tool of both entertainment and re-education. In place of Nazi propaganda reels, German theaters began showing American movies. Westerns, comedies, and wartime dramas captivated audiences hungry for escape and new ideas. Hollywood's heroes, cool, confident, and unburdened by ideological fanaticism, stood in stark contrast to the militarized figures of recent German history. In these films, Germans saw a world that was modern, colorful, and full of possibility. They watched characters drive across open highways, live in spacious suburban homes, and enjoy casual conversations in diners. Even for those who understood little English, the imagery was enough. It painted a picture of life that was aspirational, comforting, and radically different from the grim austerity of post-war Europe. American literature and magazines also found their way into German homes. Soldiers shared issues of Life, Reader's Digest, and the Saturday Evening Post. These publications, filled with photographs, advertisements, and short stories, offered windows into American society. Articles about family life, science, education, and technology gave Germans a sense of what the post-war world might look like if shaped by American values rather than authoritarian doctrine. Young Germans in particular gravitated toward this vision. A new subculture began to emerge, one that embraced American fashion, music, and slang. Boys styled their hair like American movie stars. Girls looked to actresses such as Rita Hayworth and Lauren Bacall as models of beauty and independence. American slang crept into everyday speech, blending with German in a playful hybrid that annoyed some adults but delighted the youth. This cultural admiration was not without tension. Many older Germans, still reeling from defeat and the loss of national pride, viewed the growing American influence with suspicion or resentment. They feared that traditional values were being eroded. Some saw the embrace of American culture as a betrayal of heritage or a shallow form of mimicry. But for the younger generation, those who would grow up to shape post-war West Germany, the appeal of American life was too strong to ignore. Even political leaders noticed the shift. As West Germany began to take shape under Allied supervision, efforts were made to harness the positive aspects of American influence without losing national identity. Schools introduced English as a second language. Exchange programs were developed. German students were encouraged to visit or correspond with peers in the United States. These initiatives were supported not only by American officials, but also by German educators who saw value in broadening perspectives. The economic recovery, known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, also played into this dynamic. Fueled by U.S. aid through the Marshall Plan and by domestic reforms, West Germany began to rebuild with astonishing speed. Factories reopened, infrastructure was repaired, and consumer goods returned to store shelves. The influence of American models, both industrial and cultural, was visible everywhere. Supermarkets, a distinctly American innovation, began to appear in German cities. Advertising became more colorful and aspirational, echoing American styles. Car ownership rose, and with it came a growing love for mobility and independence, two values closely associated with the American way of life. The Volkswagen Beetle, though German in design, became a symbol of this new era. Small, efficient, and open to the world. Cigarettes, chewing gum, and chocolate remained powerful symbols during this time. Even as rationing ended and German industries resumed production, American brands continued to carry social weight. A pack of Lucky Strikes was more than tobacco. It was a badge of modernity. A Hershey bar was more than candy. It was a connection to a world beyond war and hunger. By the early 1950s, the American presence in Germany had evolved from that of occupier to ally. The Cold War had begun, and the United States saw West Germany as a crucial partner in the fight against Soviet influence. This political alliance reinforced the cultural bond already forming at the grassroots level. The young Germans who had once begged GIs for chewing gum were now studying English, listening to jazz, and dreaming of travel across the Atlantic. In the decades that followed the Second World War, Germany transformed itself from a defeated and occupied nation into one of the most prosperous and stable democracies in Europe. But even as the country rebuilt its cities, its industries, and its political system, the memories of those early post-war years endured, etched not only in photographs and official documents, but in personal stories passed down through families. Among those stories, one theme appeared again and again: the arrival of the Americans. And more specifically, the moment when a German civilian, often a child, was handed a bar of chocolate, a tin of meat, or a pack of cigarettes by a soldier in uniform. These small, everyday objects took on a meaning far beyond their material value. They became symbols of survival, of human kindness, and of an entirely different kind of world, one marked by abundance, freedom, and possibility. The emotional power of these encounters lingered, not because of the taste of the chocolate or the brand of the cigarette, but because of what they represented at a time when almost everything else had been lost. In post-war memoirs, interviews, and oral histories, former German civilians often recalled these gifts with remarkable clarity. One woman, who was a teenager in Cologne in the spring of 1945, described her first experience with a Hershey bar as a moment that felt like waking up from a bad dream. She remembered the American soldier who gave it to her, not his name or face, but the gentleness of the gesture and the realization that the war was truly over. For many, these memories were inseparable from the broader experience of defeat and reconstruction. The rations and supplies distributed by American troops were not simply foreign aid. They were a contrast to the propaganda and promises of the Nazi regime. Years of slogans and sacrifice had led to rubble and hunger. Yet now, the former enemy was providing food, warmth, and even pleasure. It was a contradiction that reshaped how many Germans understood the world and their place in it. Historians have often focused on the geopolitical dimensions of this period: the Marshall Plan, the Cold War, the establishment of West and East Germany. But beneath these global currents were countless human interactions, silent exchanges, shared meals, acts of generosity that played a profound role in shaping post-war consciousness. The impact of American rations was particularly strong among children. Those who were young in the late 1940s grew up associating the United States with relief and reassurance. For them, a GI handing out chewing gum or a can of peaches was not just a foreigner, it was a symbol of hope. These impressions, formed at a formative age, helped to create a generation that looked outward rather than inward, that associated democracy with stability, and that welcomed international cooperation. Over time, the emotional memory of these early encounters became part of West Germany's national story. Newspapers, books, and television programs revisited the Trümmerjahre, or years of rubble, often emphasizing the role of the Allies in helping Germany get back on its feet. Images of American soldiers feeding hungry children became part of public remembrance, especially in the western part of the country. American products, too, maintained their symbolic power. Even as Germany developed its own thriving consumer economy, brands like Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike, and Hershey retained a nostalgic aura. They reminded people of a time when such items were rare and precious. In some families, old ration tins or cigarette cartons were kept as mementos, tokens of survival and transformation. The German government, for its part, came to recognize the cultural significance of these memories. In the years after reunification, several public history projects were launched to document civilian experiences during and after the war. Exhibits in museums included not only military artifacts and political documents, but also everyday items, mess kits, ration boxes, and wrappers from American chocolate bars. These items told stories that official histories could not. The symbolism of American rations also extended beyond Germany. Across much of Western Europe, where U.S. forces had fought and remained during the post-war years, similar memories emerged. In Italy, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, civilians remembered the American GI as a bringer of both victory and comfort. The pattern repeated itself: food, cigarettes, and chewing gum, each an entry point into a wider world. However, it is important to note that this legacy was not without complexity. For some Germans, especially older generations, the memory of the occupation remained painful. The presence of foreign troops, even well-intentioned ones, was a reminder of defeat and dependence. Not all encounters were friendly. There were cases of resentment, exploitation, and tension. But over time, the more positive associations gained ground, especially as Germany regained sovereignty and became a key ally of the United States in the emerging Cold War. Culturally, the influence of those early American encounters continued to shape German society in subtle ways. The post-war youth movements of the 1950s and 60s were deeply inspired by American models of freedom and individualism. German rock and roll, beat poetry, and political activism drew from U.S. examples. Even the design of consumer goods, advertising, and fashion carried traces of American style. In education and diplomacy, transatlantic connections deepened. Exchange programs brought thousands of German students to study in the United States, while American scholars and teachers came to Germany. These exchanges often began with personal curiosity, but they were rooted in a broader historical memory, one in which the first point of contact had been something as simple as a shared meal or a piece of candy in a bombed-out street. The legacy of those early post-war years is still visible today. In towns across Germany, memorial plaques and exhibitions honor the civilian experience of recovery. Veterans and former civilians have shared their testimonies with younger generations. School textbooks include accounts of American aid, often told through personal stories. And while global politics have shifted many times since then, the image of the American GI sharing his rations remains a symbol of what is possible when victory is tempered by compassion. Looking back, it is striking how much meaning was carried by such small objects. A chocolate bar, a tin of meat, a packet of cigarettes, items designed for battlefield nutrition became symbols of peace, modernity, and rebirth. They were proof that another way of life existed, and that even after destruction, something new could be built. In a world often defined by conflict and division, The story of American rations in post-war Germany reminds us of the power of everyday acts. When armies meet civilians, the smallest gesture can carry the heaviest weight. When survival turns into memory, even a stick of gum can shape how history is understood. This is how rations became more than supplies. They became stories. And for many Germans, they were the first taste of a new world.